Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Leuktra, fought on July the 6th, 371 BC. Famously enough, between the Boeotians, led by the Thebans, and the Spartans, along with their allies, during the post-Corinthian War conflict. Now we'll give some background to it. The battle took place in the vicinity of, in fact, Leuktra, a village in Boeotia, in the territory of Thespiae, right? The Spartan right, the position of which was essentially the one which the most important part of the battle took place, was just a little bit northeast of Leuktra. Right, so it would be the exact spot. And the battle is simply one of the most famous in military history, right? It's the Theban victory that shattered the Spartan hegemony, like over the Hellenic world, at least as far as the military primate really was on land in a political warfare. And coming in a moment of still essentially of Spartan dominance just after the Peloponnesian War, or at least that had been won by the Lacedaemonians a generation earlier, fundamentally maintaining the balance with Athens unshattered. Now, this is such an important battle that today I want to cover from a tactical point of view. So this is tactical explanation video. That from my playlist that at least I try to maintain with some standards as far as properly reading the sources is concerned. Thus, for such important event, I thought to read just straight from the sources, as we've done for other classical battles as well, right? When it gets to medieval times where we have 30 sources at a time, it's a bit more complex, and that I try to do everything accurate there, but it's just the storytelling is going to be different, because here we can just base ourselves on those essentially three sources and getting essentially all we know from the battle. And for this reason, we will again read fundamentally Plutarch from his Pelopidas. One of the single greatest tragedies in the history of mankind is that, unfortunately, Plutarch's parallel lives of Epaminondas and Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus were lost, right? So, huge tragedy. At least we get a tiny bit from Plutarch's Pelopidas instead. Then we have the Diodorus Siculus, right? That was essentially a contemporary of Plutarch in the 1st century BC. That gives us the most extensive account with lots of interesting extra info. However, definitely the best, the most important as well source is Xenophon, right? That was contemporary to the events, and that essentially had, as you know, quite of an eye. We've seen, we've quoted him at least from, in other videos about, Athenian cavalry, for example, and that we will have to study also more thoroughly on other occasions. I say this because my intention is to make actually at least another couple of videos on the meaning of the Battle of Leuktra. For a series of reasons we will probably digress on today, essentially commenting on the texts that are, again, essentially what we get from history. So any other kind of historiographical elaboration is fundamentally stemming from them. As this battle presents, as you know, with not just like an epochal change, right? The end, as we were saying before, of Spartan hegemony as a land power, as an hoplitic force. That's also unhinging the entire Spartan system, right? Actually risking the same destruction of Sparta herself that at a point had just to enclose herself in her walls, watching the Thebans devastating all around, something for which they had mocked the Athenians during the Peloponnesian War, and so on. So really, that's actually the most significant aspect of that, and how, of course, the Thebans achieved that, because we're talking, what's the context, right? Basically, the Spartan Athens had been exhausting each other, the Achaemenid Empire intervenes, brokers a peace, and the Thebans, that are the ones that are actually in the phase of growth because of this enormous fertile plains, and this sense of revanchism they had towards Sparta that had invaded their territory at some multiple points, decides to actually continue the war, giving Sparta pretext to invade actually the same Boeotia, which was again not what all the Boeotian League really wanted, but the Thebans and essentially their military leaders, Epaminondas and Pelopidas, decided for, in fact, luring the Spartans and giving battle against them in open field, and to crush this elite that at that point, if knocked out of the field, would be so not just tactically but also strategically, because the Spartans didn't really have the resources to replace that as the finest hoplites around in terms of training, right, and discipline, etc. And the Boeotians essentially investing in order to succeed in their mass, their muscular force, actually a bet on the stability of a different type of array. We've seen this already in the video about the Battle of Delium, that at the time was 25 ranks deep. At Leuktra, as we will see now, it would be 50, and that counted essentially. Say, this is the point why I need a bit more of criticism of the battle in separated videos, because I could be talking about this for hours. Being compared as a tactic, so concentrating like a sort of this column almost, actually was an 80 per 50, right? Now they were inferior to the Spartans, even just America, but it would concentrate that overwhelming mass and the brutal force on a single place. By the way, in the moment, as we will see now, the Spartans had understood the game and had been trying to actually change the formation to outflank the Thebans at the same time, to smash into them and to break all the delicate bounds that, of course, just the Spartan hoplites were able to maintain, reforming so quickly because of their intensive training and so on, and literally smashing with brute force. It was a bet, right? This was not a dramatic, radical, revolutionary, or whatever you want to, whatever firework you want to use. The tactics to change everything. Of course, there is an important military logic behind that, but this stems primarily from a political test, fundamentally. The same Epaminondas would be killed in battle in years later, exactly enacting the same tactics, which was again always a risk, because you expose by say concentrating your forces so much in depth, you would expose still your flanks by a degree. But this battle is often remembered for mostly the concept of bleak order, that also echoes always like your average Facebook pseudo-intellectual will say, this is just like your bleak order, like the tactics eventually Frederick of Prussia. This is not exactly it, right? For a reason we will explain now, because I would need those two videos to explain it at length, because reading the passages will be excruciatingly long, etc. But essentially, the oblique order in the Theban case was essentially an echelon formation, created not to fundamentally catch the enemy asymmetrically by surprise with a front that would be inclined in a different way than the one of the enemy, so taking them apart from the flank, right? This was actually a way to detach other sections of the same Spartan army in an advance against the other sections of the Boeotian, the other echelons of the Boeotian infantry that were also less loyal towards Thebes, that was leading the way on the left, also unconventionally compared to what normally the Greeks did, and so catching the Spartans by surprise and confronting them on their right, to essentially push all against their elite, because the other guys on the Spartan left facing the Theban right, the Boeotian right, were not. They were just allies, right, and not the very elite. Thus, trying to detach this was the objective. Not taking them at a different angle that would cause any advantage in that sense, but just detaching spatially as much as possible that Spartan right from the rest of their troops, so that everything could be decided merely by this frontal clash. Right, what happened in the 7 Years' War with Frederick the Great is something else. Right, it was essentially trying to the dream of the mid 18th century, trying to outflank the enemy. Right, to try to not to concentrate much of a force in a specific section of the line at the expense of another, but literally attacking the enemy from a different angle that thus would provide a specific advantage locally in the moment in which the enemy line was invested fundamentally in part from the side, and so losing in part its fire, vector, the vectorial capability. And it's a concept that is also applied to different armies with different sizes, with a different extension on the field. Nothing comparable with what was done at Leuktra, and especially completely different in terms properly of strategic logic, right? So there is nothing so flattering about claiming that you understand that Epaminondas used the oblique order, which actually was just an echelon formation, right? Compared to Frederick II, oblique order was literally an army, rotating at least to the front of the enemy at a different angle to achieve that, to put the enemy in that condition of the symmetry that would penalize it, right? So what happened at Leuktra was a substantially different thing, and again, a tactic that fundamentally was fully within hoplitic warfare as such, right? Consider at this point, Philip II of Macedon was kept as hostage in the same house of Epaminondas, and he would observe all what was happening on these battlefields to, develop, as we know, and we will keep seeing hopefully on Schwerpunkt, regarding properly the Macedonian tactics that were really a surpassing of the hoplitic warfare, right? They were not part of it. It was just like completely another thing, right? Based on the concept of combined arms and kind of, in a sense, also fully exploiting what was being balanced out at this point in terms of the possibilities of the depth of the side, because there was always about in the hoplitic battle line the concept again, how deep does it have to be, and consequently also how wide does it have to be, right? In toying with that and using, of course, other arms, the battle, as we will see, is started actually with a cavalry engagement, but fundamentally it's all about the phalanx, right? And not other arms here representing just an auxiliary, right? So these distinctions must be made anytime you want to talk about this, because it's actually all much simpler in warfare than what it actually seems, right? Most people seem to believe that the more complex war and more greater plan, something that the other had not seen, right? The entire deal of warfare in its deepest, most intimate logic is that the simpler, the more difficult, all right? So you want actually to make things simpler in warfare because it's the most difficult thing to be able to achieve in the first place, right? And this is in many ways what Leuktra, as one of the greatest battles in the history of mankind, really represents. So without much further ado, simply read the sources, I would say, in the order of, again, Plutarch, Xenophon, Diodorus, because I think it's more interesting, because Plutarch really says relatively few, unfortunately, just in what we have left of his work. And then Xenophon is kind of the core, and then Diodorus offers with really lots of other interesting details, so that we can, first the structure, then we can build on it, and simply commenting on the battle per se. Right, so Plutarch Pelopidas, here it's the section is 20 from 1 to 3 and 23. Right, you can all find it very easily in the original and translated. We're going to read translated for obvious reason. And however, the meaning is relatively simple. For a bit more of philological exegesis, perhaps we will look at it in other videos. But again, it's all fundamentally clear. Most of what we will read is not really about the battle in itself. I will try to skip the things that are really, like in this case, right? In the 21 and 22 talks all about the Leuktra, there is all a story here. So I skipped that. But Diodorus talks about the Romans as well in parallel. But I'll try to stick to the battle, but also on kind of this strategic background, because that's important as well to measure the moral quantities involved in the battle, what the Spartans were thinking, what the Boeotians were thinking, and how the plan unfolded and the battle was fought, right? So I go with Plutarch. But now the Lacedaemonians made peace with all the other Greeks and directed the war against the Thebans alone, right? So this is after the Thebans had refused basically to stop fighting, provoking the Spartans. Athens is not involved here because they had basically stuck to the peace they had brokered with the Achaemenids. This is it. Now, Cleombrotus, their king of the Spartans, invaded Boeotia with a force of 2,000 men at arms and 8,000 horse. Then, as we will see, there are other numbers in our sources. This is not so important for now. Now, a new peril confronted the Thebans, since they were openly threatened with downright dispersion, and an unprecedented fear reigned in Boeotia. It was at this time that Pelopidas, on leaving his house when his wife followed him on his way in tears, and begging him not to lose his life, said, "This advice, my wife, should be given to private men, but men in authority should be told not to lose the lives of others." And when he reached the camp and found that the Boeotarchs were not in accord, he was first to side with Epaminondas in voting to give the enemy battle. Now Pelopidas, although he had not been appointed Boeotarch, was captain of the sacred band and highly trusted, and it was right that a man should be who had given his country such tokens of his devotion to freedom. Right. What is important here is that Thebes was the most important city in Boeotia, was leading the Boeotian League, and the Spartans counted fundamentally on crushing, especially that city, in order to see the other Boeotians fundamentally switching side, right, and taking the chance to Spartan victory to crush Thebes as the city that was essentially to hegemonize the league, right? Accordingly, it was decided to risk a battle from the Boeotian side, and at Leuktra they encamped over against the Lacedaemonians. Here Pelopidas had a dream which greatly disturbed him. Now, in the plain of Leuktra are the tombs of the daughters of Scedasus, who are called from the place the Leuktridae, for they had been buried there after having been ravished by Spartan strangers. At the commission of such a grievous and lawless act, their father, since he could not get justice, at Sparta heaped curses upon the Spartans and then slew himself upon the tombs of the maidens. And ever after, prophecies and oracles kept warning the Spartans to be on watchful guard against the Leuctrian wrath. Right? It's as if the land was fighting together with the Boeotians because of this ancient Spartan sin. Most of the Spartans, however, did not fully understand the matter, but were in doubt about the place, since in Laconia there is still a little town near the sea, which is called Leuktra, near Megalopolis in Arcadia. There is a place of the same name. This calamity, of course, occurred, in fact, before the Battle of Leuktra, so here it goes on with the Leutridae and other kind of side stories. Then Plutarch goes to the battle, says of Leuktra, while Epaminondas was drawing his phalanx obliquely towards the left, right, so echelon, right, in order that the right wing of the Spartans may be separated as far as possible from the rest of the Greeks, right? So what I was saying before regarding this oblique order, right, not hitting the enemy with a different inclination of the front. The front was the same, just was echelon, and this was essentially a way to make the Spartan center and left to advance more, to detach themselves from the Spartan right, and consider this is important because it was an attempt, first of all, right, and the idea is that still the Boeotians were attacking the Spartans, right, so it was a way to kind of encourage at least part of the Spartan army to take the initiative, even as defenders abandoning their positions, in a way, but chiefly for not being close to the Spartan elite on the right, and just to leave it to the Thebans. Fundamentally, were concentrated there, so also leaving the other Boeotians to confront those other Spartan forces, and betting everything on that section on the battlefield, so that it would be essentially a Theban matter versus Sparta, as technically, as a political and strategic goal, this battle had to be, right, in case of victory, right? If defeated, it was better to have spent your entire forces in the best way, rather than risking it over the support of other less convinced Boeotian troops. So Epaminondas had deployed troops in this way so that he could, as we've seen, the Spartans may be separated as far as possible from the rest of the Greeks, and that he might thrust back Cleombrotus by a fierce charge in column with all his men at arms. The enemy understood what he was doing and began to change their formation. So the Spartans even saw it coming. Right, at least initially not, because as we were saying, it was conventional to deploy, that the Greeks had essentially an asymmetric type of deployment. Even though we think the phalanx is a somehow simple concept, actually the right was normally the strongest element of the of the battle line, and normally it also tended to be more aggressive. Right, it was the one that had also to maintain a bit the alignment during the advance, because the hoplite would be tendentially wanting to move to drift right, because it was the area where it was not protected by the shield. So whoever was on the far right was the guy who had to be firmer, stronger, not to make the formation, to guide the entire array, right, not making it shift to the right and creating an alignment. Consider that this is hoplitic warfare. There is practically nothing fully professional, right? Also, the Spartans were fundamentally a semi-professional army, right? And none of these forces were, doesn't matter how times had been changing since the more archaic way of war, etc., but the hoplitic forces were not a full-time campaign force, right? Not even the Spartans, that were the only exception in terms of continuous training, that really dedicated themselves in a sort of professional way, at least as far as the lifestyle was involved, and so much was over them. Still, technically, the say hoplitic warfare is amatorial in many ways. Again, the Thebans are not as trained as the Spartans. They could not be, because simply they didn't have the type of lifestyle mentality. They were mostly peasants. They didn't have any possibility of replicating that, right? But they were somehow, for this reason, bulkier, stronger, and Epaminondas understood that channeling this force in a narrower space with a greater depth could make the Spartan elite even crumbling under the sheer amount of numbers concentrated there, right? So nothing special about the Theban hoplite, right? Actually a lower collective training than the Spartan one, but if guided by such a popular leader like Epaminondas, was, by the way, in the first ranks, right? So that's also why he was killed years later in the same way, because he had to, was a matter of courage, of determination, of bravery, showing that political vision would be the one he invested in himself totally, right? So it's a very powerful moral incentive, right, for the forces as well, and for the future of Thebes, entirely considering how kind of ambiguous the rest of the Boeotians really were for the Theban cause, right? So what did the Spartans do when they saw what was happening, that the finest of the enemy host was essentially all concentrated, contrarily to habit, not on the left, so from the other side of the battlefield from where the Spartan elite had to fight, but exactly against them. And understanding immediately the concept of it, right? It's not that they were saying, look at these idiots, they're doing... No, they understood very well that so well in depth, these forces were a risk because they were concentrating the majority of forces just against their elite. And it was extremely dangerous. So that if you want to really make a comparison regarding Leuktra, it's not about the oblique order Epaminondas, Frederick II. It's really about this big mass of Theban infantrymen to one of the Swiss confederates, right? That basically all followed this very deep column that is useful for making this unprofessional infantry maintaining cohesion, and really pushing all that force in one, right, and in one place, and overwhelming the enemy, even without any particular sophistication, quality of the individuals, but just this big mass that had also great political cohesion because of, civic reason, for community reason, right, etc., and whichever the political and strategic context that today we cannot descend in detail, but again, hopefully we will do in another video would really exemplify. But these are really the essentials. Now, the Spartans were opening up their right wing and making an encircling movement in order to surround Epaminondas and envelop him with their numbers, right? So the idea is that not just the Spartans, by the way, were overall superior in number to the Thebans, but especially which in a political warfare was decisive. Usually, right? This is what the Thebans did against the Athenians at the Battle of Delium, except in part for accidental reasons, but say the fact that if one section of the phalanx broke, let's say you could advance and then attack the section that was still fighting from the flank, right? So the Spartans think, we have the quality, these guys want to simply break through us frontally. If we detach enough troops to essentially outflank them, they can't even have deployed their men so much in depth, again as far as 50 ranks, but they will simply be at that point done for, because they cannot fight on two fronts at the same time. But Plutarch says, at this point Pelopidas darted forth from his position with his band of 300 on the run, came up before Cleombrotus had either extended his wing or brought it back again into his old position and closed up his line of battle, so that the Lacedaemonians were not standing in array but moving confusedly about among each other when his onset reached them. Right, so there is this big body, of course, the Theban band, 300 men, running almost, but having, at least as an elite force, the cohesion for carrying that out orderly, and basically beat the Spartans over time. So there was not really a particular sophistication about this. It was about, running in hoplite gear was really a thing. Athletically speaking, it required a great toll. So that's, again, just here another way the Thebans, again, passed for the most muscular, robust, physically, athletically trained. Also, barely Hellenic by a degree, because they were Boeotian from the north, were like half barbarians, blah. But for this reason, exactly, and because that was considered a barbarian thing, like thinking about the body cult being muscular, it's something that barbarians do. The Greeks just win with reason, right? And even the Spartans that were, quite into athleticism and fitness for their military lifestyle, etc., were not as tough as an average Theban peasant soldier, right? That the kind of concept. And here, these are elite anyway, and what they simply managed to do is to basically go as speedily. So with this breaking force, right, just that is evidently gluing together because of a political cohesion, a sense of the situation, the fact that they could invest all this physical fitness into that endeavor, and simply beating the Spartans over time. I mean, the actual thing that made the Spartans the greatest army in Hellas was the fact that they repeatedly trained to perform the developing maneuvers, not just more orderly, but faster than any other Greek. This was essentially the reason why Spartans were superior. They knew how to maintain formation, they had a harsher discipline, collectively they functioned better. This was the thing. The system is simply, and in this sense genially, put in crisis just by saying, let's not give them even the time to carry out those very refined maneuvers, and let's just smash into them with brute force, right, without any tactical sophistication, without even probably caring too much for even our alignment more than much, but just not giving them the time to deploy in a way that for which we would be done for. Right, the Spartans here were actually doing the right thing, but they had underestimated how much the punching force of the rough Thebans could really be over their tactical sophistication. So this is the point, and it's not even ended here, because the Spartans fight bloodily, because they are hell of fighters themselves. In fact, Plutarch says, and yet the Spartans, who were of all men past masters in the art of war, trained and accustomed themselves to nothing so much as not to struggle or get into confusion upon a change of formation, but to take anyone without exception as neighboring rank or in file, and wheresoever danger actually threatened, to seize that point, and form in close array, and fight as well as ever. Right? At this time, however, since the phalanx of Epaminondas bore down upon them alone and neglected the rest of their force, and since Pelopidas engaged them with incredible speed and boldness, their courage and skill were so confounded that there was a flight and slaughter of the Spartans, such as had never before been seen. Right, this is dramatic. Again, we would love all to have read what Plutarch said about Epaminondas' life and about Scipio, but we do not have that. Right, so that's how he simply concludes. Therefore, although Epaminondas was Boeotarch, Pelopidas was not Boeotarch and commanded only a small portion of the whole force, won as much glory for the success of victory as it did. So here the centrality of command, of partnership, of leadership, of kind of tactical vision, in order to carry out this attack, this fast attack that would compromise Spartan order, well, this just Pelopidas could give the order to do that, and he took a specific strength, determination, that just by itself may have made the battle. At least, there are many things that made the battle, but if you had detracted just, say, this out of them, would have failed, right? So this is particularly important, just as brief as it is. Then let's pass to Xenophon's Hellenica, 6-4 from 8 to 15, right? So this is the deal. But in battle, at any rate, everything turned out adversely for the Lacedaemonians. So he's talking about Leuktra, right? So he starts by saying essentially everything that could go wrong for them did go, right? So in stressing also the fact that in this sense the Thebans had been lucky. At least luck is never, random. There is something about, of course, the boldness, right? So fortune favors the bold. That is the sense also of what the Thebans were practically doing, right? They dared facing the most fearsome army in Greece that any other would have. Just think about the Athenians, never facing them in open field. During the Peloponnesian Wars, they were terrified of losing, just because they knew they were not as good as the Spartans. Here the Thebans think they are, right, and manage to sort out the right plan to an incredibly bold, risky one. Everything now depended, the future of Thebes depended on this battle, right? So that's the moment in which the greatest pressure brings to the greatest kind of mind, work, you can argue, but also the greatest determination, given that the situation outlines itself without too many abstractions just in front of you, right? While Xenophon says, while for the other side everything went prosperously, the Thebans, even to the gifts of fortune, for it was after the morning meal that Cleombrotus held his last council over the battle, and drinking a little, as they did, at the middle of the day, it was said that the wine helped somewhat to excitement. So a bit of liquid courage by drinking alcohol before the battle from the Spartan side, which is something, and that they did, but it may also speak of a bit the fact that we're not so fully comfortable about facing the Boeotians, that were known as tough people, even though they were the Spartans, right? But they and exactly because they were, right? This is the other prejudice that we are often fed with, that he was, superior to the others, kind of belittles the others. Actually, was superior to the others actually is the best person, the most qualified person to evaluate the others, and therefore, militarily speaking, also the one that knows better than any other what are the risks involved there, right? I already made such considerations, for example, in the video about riding into hell, or in the constant nightly awareness of the infantry potential in medieval Europe. Here it's a bit the same, because after all, the Spartans, yes, we're talking about infantry here, but the Spartans were a bit the knights of the situation. It was something deeply sacred and archaic in their own, and traditional in their own religious way to war, and the idea that the individual had to be cultivated in that sense of superiority, lording over all the other, this other subjugated populations, and so on. Then Xenophon says, again, when both sides were arming themselves and it was already evident that there would be a battle, because consider that confrontations lasted long, but you could immediately sense where, that day, that the main clash would have occurred. So, in the first place, after those who had provided the market, and some baggage carriers and such as did not wish to fight, had set out to withdraw from the Boeotian army, the Lacedaemonian mercenaries under Heron, the peltasts of the Phocians, and among the horsemen, the Heracleots and Phliasians made a circuit and fell upon these people as they were departing, and not only turned them about, but chased them back to the camp of the Boeotians. Thereby they made the Boeotian army much larger and more densely massed than it had been before. This is an interesting note that eventually doesn't recur in the account, but even though it's a bit vague, right? Not always the ancient sources tell us precisely the, as you understand from here, the spaces, the dimensions, the times, whatever. But here you have basically Xenophon saying that there were some Boeotians, together with some settlers, the baggage train, the market image, and again, this what these armies really were, that basically wanted to leave, so they didn't believe much in the Theban choice of giving battle. We've seen before that the Boeotarchs did not agree with each other. It was Epaminondas and Pelopidas the Thebans that made the thing happen, giving battle to the Spartans. It was seen, aside even from the political rivalries, objectively a big deal in the first place. All these forces are chased back by while they're leaving the field by some Spartan mercenaries and peltasts. So these were forces that, as you know, during the Peloponnesian War had basically increased in number and relevance in Hellenic armies. For exactly this kind of engagements that were mostly about skirmishes, kind of quicker engagements, smaller ones, etc., and push all these people back to the Boeotian camp. Now, we're not told, this is not exactly like a great news for the Boeotians themselves. The main thing being here, what Xenophon means is that at least some of these people basically would take part in the battle in order kind of secured further the Boeotian camp that is not looted by the Spartans, as it sometimes happened with these minor engagements, that they arrived to loot the enemy camp while, say, the troops were already deployed somewhere else outside of it. This doesn't seem to be the case. It mostly seems like perhaps somebody also was there still, and that thought that they could leave, right? Because they again didn't want to follow the Thebans against the Spartans. Decided to remain and took part to the battle, right? So an apparent Spartan tactical success that, however, didn't really help depleting the Boeotian forces here. But again, Xenophon told us that there were all these little factors that all turned in favor, in a way or another, to the Boeotians. And the source goes on and says, in the second place, since the space between the armies was a plain, really there weren't many features here to consider regarding the terrain. The Lacedaemonians posted their horsemen in front of their phalanx, because it was an open ground, it was suited for cavalry. And the Thebans, in like manner, posted theirs over against them. Now, the cavalry of the Thebans was in good training as a result of the war with the Orchomenians and the war with the Thespians, while the cavalry of the Lacedaemonians was exceedingly poor at the time, for the richest men kept the horses, and it was only when the band was called out that the appointed trooper presented himself. Then he would get his horse and such arms as were given him and take the field on the moment's notice. Right? So Xenophon says that while the Boeotians had an important cavalry experience against in the war between Thebes and Orchomenus and Thespia, and so developed a substantial mounted properly cavalry force. That in Boeotia was surely also, generally speaking, larger than in Attica or the Peloponnese, right? Because they were more like Northerners, they had more wider plains. Again, the Thebans were not like the Thessalians or the Macedonians we talk about their cavalry, but generally speaking, they were a bit more flexible in this sense and a bit more habituated to horse in battle Again, I made a video about Athenian cavalry. We often discount how important cavalry actually was at, let's say, during the time of the Peloponnesian War, etc. Here the point, though, is that the Spartans are considered basically just poor horsemen because those who could afford the horses for war normally were literally presented with a mount and all the necessary gear just shortly before the battle, and so they didn't have much of another practice or just a way to accustom themselves with the animal, with the, say, being fit, ready, well trained, just before the battle from a consistent time. Right, so direct military experience versus something a bit more artificial in nature. Xenophon says, as for the man, on the other hand, it was those who were least strong of body and least ambitious who were mounted on the horses. Right. Such then was the cavalry on either side. Coming now to the infantry, was said that the Lacedaemonians led each half company 3 files abreast, and that this resulted in the phalanx being not more than 12 men deep. So it was like usually either 8, 12 men. The Thebans, however, were massed not less than 50 shields deep. Right? This suggests maybe even more in some files, calculating that if they conquered that part of the army which was around the king, all the rest of it would be easy to overcome. So they literally were aiming at Cleombrotus' bodyguard, right? And as you understand here, by the way, you'd say, but, what's the point of, couldn't the Spartans do something more, given that here the Thebans do not want to outflank the Spartans, something like the Thermopylae and simply resisting frontally? Well, not really, because at the Thermopylae, you wouldn't have, it was a much narrower ground in the first place, was another story, but you wouldn't have properly the type of hoplitic force deployed in depth and accustomed to great physical exertion with the specific aim to crash, to concentrate on a specific section, to knock out the enemy general. Right? This was literally the Thebans' plan here, with something really very different, so that it considered that in a political warfare there is a natus mos, that is to say, even if, yes, the people from the first ranks would have had to cope immediately with the Spartans, it surely had to be pretty darn good in their own regard. There was all the muscular push from the posterior ranks that was much greater than the one of the Spartans. Right? So here we see not more than 8 to 12 ranks that have to maintain, say, they have to hold the pressure of more than, say, from 50 or more ranks in front of them. Like, that's a great disparity. And this is not even to say that the Spartans were, as we will see now, just crashing at the moment. There was a fierce fight that lasted a consistent amount of time, where there was an atrocious amount of dead concentrated in a single spot, because they resisted, right? So the Spartans were pretty damn good themselves, right? Just here there was a disparity that the Thebans managed to exploit at their own advantage, right? Putting the enemy in a condition of inferiority from which they could not really escape, as we've seen, not even through, again, an outflanking tactic. That this is what the actual Spartans had tried, not the Thebans, right? Also because they didn't have much of a counter, maneuver, because the Spartans were better than them at that, right? So it was already lost in advance. What Epaminondas wanted was, in Pelopidas also helped crucially enact it. There's a very specific plan, as simple as it was: speed, force, concentration, concentrated properly in that section of the line to knock out the Spartan monarch and making the entire Spartan army crumbling under the sheer pressure, right, put at that critical point. Now, when Xenophon goes on, Cleombrotus began to lead his army against the enemy. In the first place, before the troops under him so much as perceived that he was advancing, the horsemen had already joined battle, and those of the Lacedaemonians had speedily been worsted. Right. Then in their flight they had fallen full of their own hoplites, and besides, the companies of the Thebans were now charging upon them. This aspect is important because, as we will see, the cavalry engagement was not so important. Like, again, infantry was decisive. This cavalry had, by this point, gained just an ancillary role, say a better defined ancillary role in hoplitic battles, and the Boeotians, it was a moral test in a way, and the Boeotians partly disordered the Spartan lines before the battle because of this cavalry movements, in part the same Spartan horse fleeing, and the Thebans probably harassing some of the units or passing through them. Again, they were not to smash with repeated charges or things like that, as a single formation, a unique block. But they a bit contributed to disordering the Spartan array, right? Especially on this was not on the right wing, right, but on the center, on the left of the Spartans. So there is not much press about what happened in that section against the other Boeotians, but of course they fought, and this cavalry clash advantaged the Boeotians specifically. Nevertheless, Xenophon says, the fact that Cleombrotus and his men were at first victorious in the battle may be known from this clear indication. They would not have been able to take him up and carry him off still living, had not those who were fighting in front of him been holding the advantage at that time. Meaning that at a certain point of the battle, even after Cleombrotus had been killed, the Spartans were able to recover his body, and so they were in a condition still to kind of functionally achieve something also over the Thebans. And consider again, the clash would unleash on the Spartan right and the Theban left, respectively, was extremely bloody. Right? Again, we've seen that there was the sacred band against the Spartiatus, and the general concentration of the bloodshed of it. We will see now 400 Spartiatus, at least another 1,000 hoplites died there alone, which is incredibly high, considering that, again, this is just the spot where they fought, not just what also happened after the battle. So, Xenophon goes on and says, but when Danon, the Polemarch, Sphodrius, one of the king's 10 companions, and Cleonymus, the son of Sphodrius, had been killed too, then the royal bodyguard, the so-called aides of the Polemarch, and others fell back under the pressure of the Theban mass, right? While those who were on the left wing of the Lacedaemonians, when they saw that the right wing was being pushed back, gave way. Because of course that was the elite, right? And if the king had given way, there was no way to recover the situation. Again, it's the mass of the Thebans concentrated that really makes the freaking thing. So as you see here, the Spartans, there is a progression, right? A lot of Spartan commanders dying gradually. So this was a very intense fight, not just big crack, but something that went on, over different charges too, but that had evidently compromised the Spartan capacity to react successfully. So the Thebans had succeeded in disordering them, and kind of keep pressuring thanks to this, to the ranks kept pushing from the rear with such a deep formation. Xenophon says, yet, despite the fact that many had fallen and that they were defeated, after they had crossed the trench which chanced to be in front of their camp, they grounded their arms at the spot from which they had set forth. The camp, to be sure, was not on ground which was altogether level, but rather on the slope of a hill. After the disaster, some of the Lacedaemonians, thinking it unendurable, said that they ought to prevent the enemy from setting up their trophy and try to recover the bodies of the dead, not by means of truce, but by fighting. The Polemarchs, however, seeing that of the whole number of Lacedaemonians, almost 1,000 had been killed, so 1 out of 10, seeing further that among the Spartiatae themselves, of whom there were some 700 there, about 400 had fallen, and perceiving that the allies were one and all without heart for fighting, while some of them were not even displeased at what had taken place, right, because not just the Boeotians had this kind of political divisions. Everybody understood now how much Sparta had bled white on this field for things to change accordingly at home, gathered together the most important personages and deliberated about what they should do. And as all thought it best to recover the bodies of the dead by a truce, they finally sent a herald to ask for a truce. After this, the Thebans set up a trophy and gave back the bodies under a truce. And this detail tells us still that the Spartans were willing to even fight again, even after having lost so many troops and some basically more than half of their very elite, right? So this tells how high really Spartan military quality really was, but how the Thebans had managed to essentially overwhelm them anyway, just with the sheer force of the numbers concentrated. So this is Xenophon about it, and as you understand, it's a concise, powerful, effective. It's just Xenophon, right? You know, if you are habituated to his prose, you know how, again, how Greek he is, obviously, in the way he tells things, but again, how much he also influenced through his works the way we think, the way we read history, the way we even describe battles, and this is quite fascinating. So I would conclude and then express some other consideration with Diodorus 1553-56, right? So Diodorus Siculus is we're back to the 1st century BC, the same age of Plutarch. So it's a bit, again, a great collector of all the kind of the Hellenistic stories with lots of details that you see now. So it's interesting how it starts, because it has the form of annals. It says, when Alcestis was archon at Athens, the Romans elected 8 military tribunes with consular power: Lucius and Publius Valerius, Gaius Terentius, Lucius Manessius, Gaius Sulpicius, Titus Papirius, and Lucius Aemilius. And the Eleans celebrated the 102nd Olympiad, in which Damon of Turi won the stadium race. During their term of office, after the Lacedaemonians had held the supremacy in Greece for almost 500 years, a divine portent foretold the loss of their empire. For there was seen in the heavens during the course of many nights a great blazing torch, which was named from its shape a flaming beam, and a little later, to the surprise of all, the Spartans were defeated in a great battle, which is Leuktra, and irretrievably lost their supremacy. Some of the students of nature ascribed the origin of the torch to natural causes, voicing the opinion that such apparitions occur of necessity at appointed times, and that in these matters the Chaldeans in Babylon and other astrologers succeeded in making accurate prophecies. These men, they say, are not surprised when such a phenomenon occurs, but rather, if it doesn't, since each particular constellation has its own peculiar cycle, and they complete these cycles through age-long movements in appointed courses. At any rate, this torch had such brilliancy, they report, and its light such strength, that it cast shadows on the rather similar to those cast by the moon. At this time, Artaxerxes, the Persian king, seeing that the Greek world was again in turmoil, sent ambassadors calling upon the Greeks to settle their internecine wars and establish a common peace in accordance with the covenants they had formerly made. All the Greeks gladly received this proposal, and all the cities agreed to a general peace, except Thebes. For the Thebans alone, being engaged in bringing Boeotia under a single confederacy, under them, of course, were not admitted by the Greeks, because of the general determination to have the oaths and treaties made city by city. So remaining outside the treaties as formerly, the Thebans continued to hold Boeotia in a single confederacy, subject to themselves. Right, so that's how it's a bit of the political background that we were saying before regarding the fact that there was some general Boeotian understanding that the war, they didn't want the war to be over, right? Because Athens and Sparta may have been tired, but the Thebans, say at least the Boeotians, hegemonized by the Thebans, in this case, but they were aware of their strength and they knew they could gain something out of that. Again, the rise of, again, I made that video about the Battle of Delium that tells also how the Thebans had been, carving out their own space. They had this mixed relations with Athens and Sparta from a long time, of course. Then Diodorus goes on, says, the Lacedaemonians, being exasperated by this, decided to lead a large army against them as common enemies, for they cast an extremely jealous eye upon their increase of power, the one we just noticed, fearing lest, with the leadership of all Boeotia, they might break up the Spartan supremacy, given a suitable opportunity, for they constantly practiced gymnastics and had great bodily strength, and since they were naturally lovers of war, they were inferior to no Greek nation in deeds of valor. Right, so the thing, naturally this is written centuries afterwards, but there is a bit of kind of advanced storytelling, but the concept is clear. I mean, the fact that the Spartans had rightly identified in this mounting Boeotian power, again, a threat, given that there were lots of hoplites. They were, of course, not as good as the Spartans, as we've seen, but there were more, right? They were physically strong, even stronger than the Spartans, because they were a rougher people. And this force, right, of, again, sturdy peasants that were also accustomed to war, just for their internal and external experience, they had already showed what they could be capable to do also against Athens and other relevant contenders, that they could really create a problem to Sparta, right, in this situation. So again, the fact that they had decided to stay out of the peace brokered by the Persians shows what we were saying regarding their intentions that the Spartans were rightfully suspicious of, and plus with that prophecy that their hegemony would have been broken at that point. They were probably getting nervous about the thing. So Diodorus goes on and says, they had, besides leaders, conspicuous, speaking of the Thebans, conspicuous for their virtues, greatest among them being 3 men, Epaminondas, Gorgidas, and Pelopidas. The city of the Thebans was full of pride because of the glory of its ancestors in the heroic age, right? They said, Hercules had been born there, and that's also why the club, is the symbol of Thebes. And the Spartans also claimed first an Herculean identity by a degree, so this is also interesting. And aspired to mighty deeds. In this year, then, the Lacedaemonians were making ready for war, levying armies both of their own citizens and from their allies as well. When Phrasiclatus was archon at Athens, the Romans elected 80 military tribunes with consular power: Publius Manius, Gaius Arenusius, Gaius Sextus, Tiberius Julius, Lucius Lavinius, Publius Trebonius, and Gaius Manlius, and besides Lucius Tensius again. During the term of office, the Thebans, since they were not participants in the truce, were forced to undertake alone the war with the Lacedaemonians. For there was no city that could legally join them, because all had agreed to the general peace. The Lacedaemonians, since the Thebans were isolated, determined to fight them and reduce Thebes to complete slavery. And since the Lacedaemonians were making their preparations without concealment and the Thebans were destitute of allies, everyone assumed that they would be easily defeated by the Spartans. Accordingly, some of the Greeks who were friendly to the Thebans sympathized with them at the prospect of defeat, while others who were at odds with them were overjoyed at the thoughts that Thebes would in a trice be reduced to utter slavery. Finally, the Lacedaemonians, their huge army ready, gave command of it to Cleombrotus, their king, and first of all sent envoys ahead to Thebes, directing the Thebans to permit all of the Boeotian cities to be independent, to the people Plataea and Thespiae, and to restore the land to its former owners. When the Thebans replied that they would never meddle with affairs in Laconia, and that the Spartans had no right to touch those of Boeotia, such being the tenor of their answers, the Lacedaemonians sent Cleombrotus forth immediately with his army against Thebes. And the Spartan allies were eager for the war, confident that there would be no contest or battle, but that they would master the Boeotians without a struggle. The Spartans accordingly advanced till they came to Coronea, where they encamped and waited for such of their allies as were tardy. Right. Incidentally, this is where the Thebans would be crashed later on by the Macedons, by the way. The Thebans, because, you see, it was also about the geography of Boeotia, not only, of course, geopolitics does not really exist, but it would turn out to be the hell of a battlefield in general as a region in Greece, even, and naturally also for the rise of Macedon later on. And as we've seen, just the plain of Leuktra was quite suited for a pitched battle. Now, the Thebans, in view of the presence of the enemy, first voted to remove their wives and children to safety in Athens, because at least this was out of sight, so they could be sure about it, and the Spartans didn't have really enough resources to conquer it. Then chose Epaminondas general, and turned over him the command in the war, giving him as his advisors 6 boiotharchs. Epaminondas, having conscripted for the battle all Thebans of military age and the other Boeotians who were willing and qualified, led forth from Thebes his army, numbering in all not more than 6,000. As the soldiers were marching out from the city, it seemed to many that unfavorable omens appeared to the armament. For by the gates Epaminondas was met by a blind herald who, seeking recovery of runaway slaves, just as was usual, cried his warning not to take them from Thebes nor to spirit them away, but to bring them home and keep them secure. Now the older people amongst those who heard the herald considered it an omen for the future, but the younger folk kept quiet, so as not to appear through cowardice to hold Epaminondas back from the expedition. But Epaminondas replied to those who told him that he must observe the omen. One only omen is best, to fight for the land that is ours. Though Epaminondas astounded the cautious by his forthright answer, a second omen appeared more unfavorable than the previous one, for as the clerk advanced with a spear and a ribbon attached to it and signaled the orders from headquarters, a breeze came up, and as it happened, The ribbon was torn from the spear and wrapped itself around a slab that stood over a grave, and there were buried in this spot some Lacedaemonians and Peloponnesians who had died in the expedition under Agesilaus. Some of older folk, who again chanced to be there, protested earnestly against leading the force out in the face of the patent opposition of the gods. But Epaminondas, deigning them no reply, led forth his army, thinking that considerations of nobility and regard for justice should be preferred as motives to the omens in question. Right, this is an important concept traditionally, because there is always the idea that if you essentially deal with chance, the luck can be controlled by a degree, and that if, of course, this was from their side, of course, a righteous enterprise, even the omen were to be seen just mostly as a superstition, right? Not something that was actually speaking of bravery and of right and of reason, what man can accomplish. Epaminondas accordingly was trained in philosophy, in fact, and applied sensibly to the principle of his training, was at the moment widely criticized, but later, in the light of his successes, would be considered to have excelled in military shrewdness, and did contribute the greatest benefits to his country. Right, so that's the point, right? It's a bit like the risks in warfare in the first place. For he immediately led forth his army, seized in advance to pass at Coroneia, and encamped there. Cleombrotus, learning that the enemy had seized the pass first, decided against forcing a passage there, proceeded instead through Phocis, and when he had traversed the shore road, which was difficult, entered Boeotia without danger. In his passage, he took some of the fortresses and seized 10 triremes. Right, these were basically almost all the entire Boeotian fleet. Right, it wasn't particularly large. Right, so this had seemingly started poorly for the Boeotians, but that's a bit the point of the land, that it has so many people. You can. Boeotia didn't have many fortifications, so it didn't have many ships. Those costed a freaking lot. The Athenians were the ones that had mostly invested in them. But in Boeotia there were practically no taxes. It was believed that just the force of all these masses of men were just enough, and the maintaining these local levies in a kind of a civic sense was just also relatively cheap in comparison. It would also grant a bit everyone to be still feeling relatively autonomous from one another. And in a defensive context like this, even though the Thebans passed to counterattack in a strategic sense, but still, the idea that the hoplites were still formidable, bulks of men, of heavy infantry that had to be surpassed, right? And there was plenty of them to defend the land, made the Thebans again confident in their own, at least, defensive capacities. And these losses were important, right? This is a serious deal. The Spartans again have invaded you. It's not that the Boeotians were about to say, okay, well, we don't mind, the Spartans just invaded us, we can fence them up. No, nobody here was thinking, oh my god, there will be this huge victory, we're so sure about that. Right? Willing that is something, and achieving it is also something else. They made it. But it's not that up to the last moment they were sure of it. It would happen, right? In war you cannot eliminate that till the decisive moment that is the last, and that's actually the point of it all. But Diodorus continues, it says, later, when he reached the place, we're talking about Cleombrotus, the place called Leuktra, he encamped there and allowed the soldiers to recover after their march. As the Boeotians neared the enemy in their advance, and then after surmounting some ridges suddenly caught sight of the Lacedaemonians covering the entire plain of Leuktra, they were astounded at beholding the great size of the army. And when the Boeotarchs held a conference to decide whether they ought to remain and fight it out with an army that many times outnumbered them, or whether they should retreat and join battle in a commanding position, it chanced that the votes of the leaders were equal. For of the 6 boyards, 3 thought that they should withdraw the army, and 3 that they should stay and fight it out, and among the latter Epaminondas was numbered. In this great and perplexing deadlock, the boyarch came to vote, whom Epaminondas persuaded to vote him, and thus he carried the day. So the decision to stake all on the issue of the battle was thus ratified. This reflects, as we've seen, the different attitude that the Thebans had compared to their allies, for the reasons, again, of the jealousy of the hegemony over Boeotia, the fact that legitimately they were kind of freaking out, and that, if the Spartans had won, at least they hoped they could take out Thebes entirely, because the Spartans would have raised it. There's no doubt. But Epaminondas was so that the soldiers were superstitious on account of the omens that had occurred. In fact, this is exactly the point we were making before. Earnestly desired, through his own ingenuity and strategy, to reverse the scruples of the soldier. Accordingly, a number of men having recently arrived from Thebes, he persuaded them to say that the arms of the temple of Heracles had surprisingly disappeared, and that word had gone abroad in Thebes that the heroes of old had taken them up and set off to help the Boeotians. Beautiful concept, by the way, because they literally, again, had those clubs depicted on their shields. He placed before them another man as one who had recently ascended from the cave of Trophonius, who said that the god had directed them, talking about Heracles, of course, Hercules, when they won at Leuktra, to institute a contest with crowns for prizes in honor of Zeus, the king. This indeed is the origin of this festival which the Boeotians now celebrate at Libade. Well, this is just a folklore note. Now, an aider and abettor of this device was Leandrius, the Spartan, who had been exiled from Lacedaemonian, and was then a member of the Theban expedition, interestingly enough. So this would boost the, generally speaking, the morale, because, once you're kicked out, there is no really any other place where you can back to it, unless you defeat those who have kicked you out. So he was produced in the assembly and declared that there was an ancient saying amongst the Spartans that they would lose their supremacy when they should be defeated at Leuktra at the hands of the Thebans. Certain local oracle mongers likewise came up to Epaminondas, saying that the Lacedaemonians were destined to meet with a great disaster by the tomb of the daughters of Leuktra and Skedausus. This is the story that also Plutarch throws in, for the following reasons. Leuktra was the person for whom this plain was named. His daughters and those of a certain Skedausus, as well being maidens, were violated by some Lacedaemonian ambassadors. The outraged girls, unable to endure their misfortune, called down curses on the country that had set forth their ravishers, and took their lives by their own hands. Many other such occurrences were reported, and when Epaminondas had convened an assembly and exhorted the soldiers by the appropriate pleas to meet the issue, they all shifted their resolutions to rid themselves of their superstition, and with courage in their hearts stood ready for the battle. There came also this time to aid the Thebans an allied contingent from Thessaly, 1,500 men, and 500 horsemen commanded by Jason. He persuaded both the Boeotians and the Lacedaemonians to make an armistice, and so to guard against the caprices of fortune. When the truce came into effect, Cleombrotus set out with his army from Boeotia, and there came to meet him another large army of Lacedaemonians and their allies under the command of Archidamus, son of Agesilaus. For the Spartans, seeing the preparedness of the Boeotians and taking measures to meet their boldness and recklessness in battle, had dispatched the second army to overcome by the superior number of their combatants the daring of the enemy. Once these armies had united, the Lacedaemonians thought it cowardly to fear the valor of the Boeotians. So they disregarded the truce, and with high spirits returned to Leuktra. The Boeotians too were ready for the battle, and both sides marshaled their forces. Now, on the Lacedaemonian side, the descendants of Heracles were stationed as commanders of the wings, named Cleombrotus and the king Archidamus. Again, this thing that the Spartan kings had this divine ancestry was a huge deal regarding their traditionalism, their way of war, etc. But you understand again that the fact that the Thebans are a bit like the thing, but this is a place where Hercules was born, and then the Spartans said we descend from Hercules. It was all about a clash between heroic supernatural forces, and Heracles was one. So it turned out he sided with Thebes after all. Archidamus, son of the king Agesilaus, well, on the yes, we're talking about Archidamus. While on the Boeotian side, Epaminondas, by employing an unusual disposition of his own, was enabled through his own strategy to achieve his famous victory. He selected from the entire army the bravest men and stationed them on one wing, intending to give to the finish with them himself. Right, this is again an important aspect of Epaminondas' leadership, that was really attacking at the head of his own men. The weakest he placed on the other wing, right, so on the right, and instructed them to avoid battle and withdraw gradually during the enemy's attack. So Diodorus says literally that these troops should have not just been echelon and therefore being in a posterior position compared to the left with the Thebans, the sacred band, etc. But that they should have properly they should have withdrawn gradually during the enemy's attack, so to detach gradually the Spartan allies and subjects from the right wing that was their right wing, and so the one that the Thebans should have pressured the most, right, to take out, as we've seen, Cleombrotus. So then, by arranging his phalanx in oblique formation, Epaminondas planned to decide the issue of the battle by means of the wing in which were the elite. When the trumpets on both sides sounded the charge of the armies, simultaneously with the first onset raised the battle cry, the Lacedaemonians attacked both wings with their phalanx in a crescent formation. This is why you find in some, pictures, say, maps of the battle of Leuktra, recreated this kind of convex formation. But we don't know more about it, telling you the truth. And always bear in mind that whenever you see crescent, you don't have necessarily to think literally at a single line that literally curves. They had to calculate exactly in that sense. Normally it's just different, let's say, units are a bit echelon their own way, right? So that they create this concave or convex formation. It's like when you say the cuneus, you don't have to think that it was literally a formation. It was triangular in shape. It was rather that it was a stronger, narrower, a bit like this one from Epaminondas. I mean, an area, let's say a unit that would be somehow particularly deep and meant to smash in, or was advanced compared, double compared to the let's say the depth of the battle line, even as a separated unit had to smash specifically in a certain area of the enemy, certain part of the enemy line, so that you couldn't quite make all these units converging on the same spot during the combat. Normally hoplitic battles were again about this two fronts, this parallel fronts, and that's it, right? At best, as we've seen in Delhi, if you break one section, you can outflank the other sections that have remained fighting. But that's something you can't quite bet on. It just, you would do it, right, if you have, but you must have the cohesion after the fight, which is extenuating. You must have the necessary amount of training. You just should be able to have a control on the man. You should be able to even know what is happening on the other side of the battlefield, because you may arrive there not finding really anyone, or maybe the enemy is, has already won and gone ahead and trying to do the same thing. I mean, everything can happen, right? So nothing is so predictable. In any case, there's information. While the Boeotians retreated on one wing, so according to plan, as we've seen, but on the other engaged the enemy in double quick time, right? So as we've seen, also with the finest in a unorthodox place of the line, and attacking speedily, because they had to bring that mass there, right, to smash the Spartans. As they met in hand-to-hand combat, at first both fought ardently, and the battle was evenly poised. Shortly, however, as Epaminondas' men began to derive advantage from their valor and the denseness of their lines, many Peloponnesians began to fall. Right, so the Spartans resist, but again, the Thebans in that section of the line managed to overwhelm them, basically. Again, imagine, from 8 to 12 ranks deep versus 50 deep, right, more. Again, you have this at the expense of the width of the formation. And here the Thebans also concentrated most of their forces. But again, this is the point. The center and the right were refused even, and what the Thebans understood, and as a Clausewitzian confirmation, that war is nothing but an instrument of war is nothing but an instrument of politics, right? Is a continuation of politics with other means. It was enough for the Thebans to crash probably the Spartan elite, to crash the entire system of Sparta back in their land, which happened because the story is that eventually Epaminondas went on, invaded the Peloponnese, Laconia, and made a mess all around, and the Spartans literally shrank and collapsed, and it was terrifying. Right, and the same Sparta was, the Thebans built enormous fortifications to literally to lock Sparta there, and Sparta herself risked to be razed to the ground completely. But it's the same that the Spartans were trying to do with Thebes, right? Crashing that meant to basically be able to hegemonize again Boeotian, because without a head, they could have all those resources, but not really being able to organize themselves again politically. So that's quite relevant. Then Diodorus goes on, for they were unable, the Spartans, to endure the weight of the courageous fighting of the elite corps. Right, so we're talking about the Theban sacred band. I shall make a video specifically on it. We will. Of those who had resisted, some fell and others were wounded, taking all the blows in the front. Right, so the Spartans had massive attributes, of course. Now, as long as King Cleombrotus of the Lacedaemonians was alive and had with him many comrades in arms who were quite ready to die in his defense, it was uncertain which way the scales of victory inclined, because again, if Cleombrotus resisted, after all, probably the Spartan morale would have not collapsed, right? But though he shrank from no danger, he proved unable to bear down his opponents and perished in an heroic resistance after sustaining many wounds. Taking down a guy in this case really in heavy armor, right, after having taken so many wounds, and it's terrifying. This man were leaving basically for proving this, right? Don't think that professionalism is just, that, let's say, as we were saying before, Hellenic warfare was fundamentally amatorial in nature. as far as the politic one specifically was, with the usual exception of the Spartans. But everybody in this world was radically obsessed with psychopathic serial killers like Achilles. Right here again, they thought they were descending from Heracles, etc. So, as at least the only useful thing, the only thing that Hema shows you is that every idiot can rush against another with all his force and roaring, and then that's literally what every single human being can do. And there is hardly any military value to it if there not something else, right? So the idea is that the Spartans had kicked ass mostly because of their discipline, and even in here, the Thebans win because of the order they picked, a strategic choice, not just random guys smashing against each other. But again, there was a furious, say, physical dimension that we tend to think wasn't there in a political warfare, in which all these people, amateurs or not, were obsessed in, because they were all indoctrinated fanatically with these histories of, Hellenic mythology, and there was literally nothing else in the world, right, at that point. So, in their world, so it was the entire deal here was measured. Hellas was a universe on its own, and this is especially true for probably in the Greek mindset, which was something very, self-referential, let's say. In any case, as we were saying here, but when, though he shrank from suffering many wounds, then as masses of men thronged about his body, there was piled up a great mound of corpses. Right. So again, in that place where the Thebans concentrate their force, the Spartans do not break immediately. They stand for a long time, and there is a massive slaughter. There being no one in command of the wing, the heavy column led by Epaminondas bore down upon the Lacedaemonians. This detail is also interesting in general. I mean, it's really the loss of the leader that the Thebans were looking to procure the Spartans, because again, it was also really a matter of leadership to make the Spartan army work, right, and having all this kind of resilient spirit as far as this, holding their ground against this human tide was really concerned. And at first, by sheer force, caused the line of the enemy to buckle somewhat. Then, however, the Lacedaemonians, fighting gallantly about their king, got possession of his body, right, but were not strong enough to achieve victory. It's as if literally this Herculean force from the Thebans had smashed, like Hercules' club, on the Spartans anyway. It doesn't matter how hard and still Herculean they were, but, really couldn't hold on the longer run. For us, the corps of elite outdid them in feats of courage, right, and the value of the exhortations of Epaminondas contributed greatly to its prowess. The Lacedaemonians were with great difficulty forced back, right? So it's also a matter of this big body of the sacred band that was meant to equate, really, also the Spartan deeds as such. At first, as the Spartans gave ground, they would not break their formation, but finally, as many fell, and the commander who would have rallied them had died, the army turned and fled in utter rout. So once it's broken, it's broken. And this was the element of the army that had to break the latest, right? Epaminondas' corps pursued the fugitives, slew many who opposed them, and won for themselves a most glorious victory. Right? Consider that, again, in these battles, doesn't matter that, as we've seen, cavalry was around, so of course there were lighter troops who would finish the job more easily. But, when you're defeated, here it's, again, it's also a world that this is experienced still today, but this is a world in which they understood also much more deeply what their defeat really meant. Also in a kind of supernatural, transcendental way. Here Sparta's hegemony had been crushed. It was something like the celestial vault having been cracked once again, right? And so people would just be psychophysically shocked and just, we know, let themselves being killed, even just sitting there doing nothing but they could run away because they were psychophysically exhausted. It was over, primarily from a mental point of view. Surely many other, right, if they couldn't save themselves, would kill themselves. As we've seen, there were some Spartans who still were willing to fight, so this is the most, again, the highest proof of how tough and kind of unscared of death, or at least, willing to face it without regrets, the Spartans really were. So about the Thebans, Diodorus says, for since they had met the bravest of the Greeks, meaning the Spartans, with a small force, had miraculously overcome many their number. Because overall the Boeotians were less than the Spartans. They won a great reputation for valor. Of course, the highest praises were accorded to the general Epaminondas, who chiefly by his own courage and by his shrewdness as a commander had defeated in battle the invincible leaders of Greece. I mean, consider this fact that Sparta had never quite suffered such defeat, right? Actually, that's why I would like to make other videos, that there had been Spartan defeats at the hand of the Thebans already, but they had been small things, right? And there had never quite been the thing of having the Spartan army, right, going fully in combat in a pitched battle against the Theban army, the Boeotian army as a whole. So this was a big deal, and because Sparta had never gotten defeated in this way, it was really the first time. And that's how basically the entire history of Greece had, say, in classical times, had been determined by, largely, at least by, from a terrestrial point of view, right? The Spartans could not be defeated in open field. Everybody knew that, right? This thing was new, right? Who could be as much as them? This is why, of course, telling more about Boeotia is important, understanding from which background these people really came from. More than 4,000 Lacedaemonians fell in battle, but only about 300 Boeotians. Following the battle, they made a truce to allow for taking up the bodies of the dead and the departure of the Lacedaemonians to the Peloponnese. Such was the outcome of events relating to the Battle of Leuktra. So, as we've seen, this is a dense military episode. After all, literally from ancient history, the first thing that comes into your mind is how few we know, right? These are some very famous, if not illustrious, sources. So we know of Epaminondas thanks to them. We know about the Battle of Leuktra in its importance, really. But we really rely on this, right? When you look at the event too, well, this looks a pretty simple one, right? After all, what is there so different about this battle from any other one of a political warfare, right? And each one is different. There is not such thing like a standard, even or a typical political battle actually happening the way we have theorized it, right? Obviously, Leuktra is a battle like no other, also in the measure of what the Thebans carried out as a tactic with the means they had and so on. But all in all, right, the way war was fought here has not been fundamentally altered. Like, nor the Thebans would say classical warfare would necessarily be. Eventually, the Macedons came around, so in a few generations, so things really change a lot, right? The Spartans actually would be capable of a much greater. I made a video specifically about the Spartan army from the 4th to the 2nd century BC, so just the army organization, but from the point of view of the defeated of Leuktra, right? So what happened later. And paradoxically, the Spartans managed to create a pretty sizable force, even of pikemen later on, that, even though their power was broken, right, really stands out, considering, again, the context and the effort they kept making after all. Naturally, I don't want to reduce the value of this battle at all. On the contrary, it's much more powerful than it is, but exactly because it's simple. Exactly because what we see at work here is not a dramatically complex strategy that required who knows which great, or it was essentially a great gamble, right? Counting essentially on the best that you had, essentially exploiting what the force of Boeotia was politically, socially, militarily, and in front of the, say, provoking Sparta as well, so acting in a way that was seeking for that to happen, because otherwise the future of the land would have been like this moment even, right? You can't find another battle of Leuktra before or after this. In fact, this would never happen. So it's as if Epaminondas, Pelopidas had, whoever supported their plan, had properly understood that this was the moment in their history for doing it. Risking it, but accepting it, and naturally opening to a new phase of Hellenic military history, again, no doubt, albeit not altering the essentials of a political warfare. This is also very, very important. There is nothing really revolutionary about this tactics. There is hardly about any tactics telling the truth. But this is actually what makes it more powerful, more punching, because when you start despoiling these events of some super constructions that have been, placed on them, you realize that what really mattered here was how really qualitative the effort, right? How really the punch of this Theban column really meant in a historical, political, social sense, for what Hellenic history had been about, right? And so we could again talk for hours about this. I'm really not going to add too much, because I also try to keep the videos long, but not too long at a point. We will come back on it just to reflect on the logic of it all, right? The moral information that we are provided by the sources. It's not much about the tactics itself, as much as the morale involved. We've seen that basically the part on the battle is practically much smaller in these texts than the description of the entire political or strategic context. And this is kind of obvious because the motivation, right, what you see on the battlefield eventually of these events is determined by something else. It's not a standard pack of something that you can eventually use as a tool on the field. It's really something that all the protagonists have been thinking of really a lot. And in this I would like to point out too that the Spartans make a great impression, telling the truth as well, right? We have noticed this in many battles that are normally, it's as if there were just military history was about, oh my god, that guy was strong, this one was weak, this one was right, this was wrong, this was intelligent, this was stupid, right? This is basically how most people look at seemingly warfare in general, but it's not quite ever the same thing. You can find substantial mistakes, you can find even delusional choices at some point, you can find accidents, you think things that go wrong for the worst or the best reasons, right? But in this case, the Spartan defeat was really immediately something they suffered, because also where do you start to evaluate when a guilt begins? for whatever happens to you. That's the actual answer you should be able to provide. Say Pelopidas had not forced in with a sacred band. What if the Spartans had managed to develop in time on the wing and outflanking Epaminondas' forces? We wouldn't be talking about Leuktra, at least in the way we do, right? And the rise of Theban hegemony, the destruction of Sparta, and so on. The Spartans fight bloodily, because that's what they were, and what they had been maintaining themselves over time. What is striking historically is for how long civilizations lasted in the past compared to today's. Right, things are much faster. Everything is kind of much more complex because it's a bigger world, and it's easy to find structural deficits that you say, "Oh my God, that army's hacked badly." Apparently, so you have to explain it too, though, which we're not really habituated to do. But when you look at this case, the Spartans, you realize that there had been a competence here, confidence in their own capacity. That is always a double-edged sword, but that cannot make you unsee, in fact, the obvious quality of the Spartan forces. So I'm not to digress now just on the meaning of Leuktra in these terms, because from the Spartan side, because we should evaluate what also in Spartan history technically happened. Over these years. I made videos about, for example, the battles of Pylos and Sphacteria, right? So we're seeing also during the Peloponnesian War, what actually happened, as much as properly the gradual arrangement of that kind of ideally classical or political warfare that again had always been on the move in many ways. It's true here that also Thebes would basically lose it to the Macedons at Chaeronea. That, as we were saying before, Philip II was just watching what was happening here, and that many intuitions passed throughout some historical events. We talked about. I made a video about the Iphicratean hoplite, which was yet another issue that we should all look at in function of all these various military events, their political, social background, and so on. I explained in that video at least pretty thoroughly mostly what the Iphicratean reform really was. Consider that in Atlantic warfare we've seen it already. There were things that around from centuries that just at some point were developed to a point where they were useful and fitting. So again, the Theban hegemony is definitely marked Leuktra in such a fashion that makes you understand they really rode the wave in the right moment. They were bold enough, they were determined enough, they were motivated enough, they were intelligent enough, and I hope to, of course, not just make multiple videos about Theban warfare and speaking about the Battle of Leuktra and the risks involved, inherent in also the type of tactics that the Thebans used. Because again, if Epaminondas died at Mantinea, exactly the same tactics, because he exposed himself too much. So how much, for example, the risk in losing in that carnage that was, the commander in that carnage we've seen at Leuktra, too, because Epaminondas was there, right? So it's always a risk. It's not the easy victory for which you can also find this inalterable system that will just defeat anybody else. It's not really how things would actually occur. In this sense, even more chapeau for the Spartans for have held such standards for such a long time, but they were properly radically different politically and socially, and also the fact that, in fact, that this came at a price. They had the best hoplites in all Greece, but one single defeat like this one could wipe out basically their entire military potential for making them shrink to a secondary power, really. So the issue is always the balance, and the balancement of the odds. This is what in military history is apparent, self-evident really about any kind of endeavor. In any case, you understand there is so much food for thought, but I will discuss this in other videos. Hopefully, for today, I stop it here. We will talk again about the Battle of Leuktra, about Epaminondas beyond the Theban world, the Theban units, the sacred band, the protagonists of this engagement, etc. However, on another time. If you enjoyed this video, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.